Hey everyone, welcome to the 16th episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matthew Freedman, the editor-in-chief of FantasyLabs. About 6 weeks ago, we did a PGA show on strokes gained. This week, we're going to talk about course history. Let's get started. Returning to the roundtable is Christian Drappi on Twitter at DFS Albatross. He's a DFS writer and projectionist for Daily Roto. Christian, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it was the last PGA show we did was maybe my favorite roundtable out of all the 15 previous ones that we've done. It was just so much great information, so it's fantastic to have you back on the show. And then also returning to the roundtable is Colin Davy at ADJ Baseline, Adjusted Baseline. He's the director of the PGA product at FantasyLabs and the two-time winner of the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Hackathon. Colin, are you excited to be doing 3 podcasts this week?
I mean, U.S. Open week is U.S. Open week. I knew what I signed up for. Majors are majors. I'm thrilled to be on pretty much all of them.
Yeah, you have to up your game along with the golfers.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, I try to optimize my predictions. That sounds sacrilegious. Actually, I try to optimize my metagame and my content around around all the majors, just like all the other guys do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's great to have you back on the show as well. And let's jump into it. In the previous PGA roundtable, you two were on the show to debate, and I use that word loosely, to debate the topic of strokes gained. It was a great episode, informative, but frankly, I think that you two were too nice to each other. But at the end of the show,
yeah, I agree.
The topic shifted to course history, and I thought we had a really lively, informative, just a great back and forth conversation. And so that's basically where I want to pick up starting this show. And so, Colin, can you give a sense of what course history is, what it entails and measures, and how you interpret it?
So course history at its simplest form is the idea of using golfers' past performances at a particular course to adjust your projections of how they will do at that course in the future. It basically entails looking at it. Entails looking and getting a sense of their course specific results and figuring out how to weight that compared to all the other factors that you weight when you're trying to predict how a golfer will do from week to week.
Okay. So, Christian, when you were last on the show, you seemed a little bit dubious as to the reliability or significance of course history, and maybe dubious is too strong of a word, but just a little uncertain about it. Can you talk about that perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think dubious is actually a pretty good word. The main concern I had was kind of this Occam's razor concern where it's like, all right, like if I haven't done any research on it, and very few people have, I think Colin was pretty much the first one to be out there, which I applaud him on doing. If you don't having done research, you should kind of assume the most simple thing and kind of go from there. Like you shouldn't kind of recklessly use things that you haven't kind of back tested and gotten out of sample results on and whatnot. So since then, I've kind of done a little bit of work in preparation for this. And I'm excited to share some of those things today, along with what Colin has to say.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, yeah, let's jump into that. So what are the types of things you would want to see when evaluating course history? And what would it take to make you think that course history actually does have some significance?
Sure. So I guess there's a few things I want to see. I mean, one is just having, predictive power. Right? That's kind of like the main thing we're looking for. But there's nuances in that we're looking for as well, right? So, if let's say the first thing I looked at was, all right, if we look at his, some players' adjusted scoring average, like previously, to predict his future performance, and we also kind of include some course history, are we going to see any kind of signal right there? And I actually found some, which is nice. That's kind of the first thing. So kind of with agreement after looking at it. However, the nuanced thing is if you kind of also include course fit, right? Does the course history still have predictive power kind of aside from that? And I think that's the more interesting question to me.
All right, well, I think we have this maybe later in the outline, but let's go ahead and jump into it because you just mentioned course fit. Colin, can you talk about course fit and how it is or is not related to course history in the research that you've done?
Yeah, so course fit is the idea of what type of playing style in general is predictive of success at a course. On our week-to-week podcast here at Fantasy Labs, we talk about if a course is set up for maybe bombers, if the rough isn't rough around the edges, or maybe it's maybe better set up for ball strikers if you're penalized for being inaccurate. Those types of generalized fits, you can say it's kind of a general rule about, in general, what type of golfer will do well here. And it is separate from course history, as is pretty much all of the other stuff that course history, and we're kind of jumping around a little bit about our definitions. But the way that I approach course history is everything that you cannot explain about a golfer's performance at a particular course in terms of whether or not they're over or underachieving their expectations, and seeing if that is predictive in the future. So course fit is one of many things that you can use to explain a golfer's success at a given course. Course history is basically, my interpretation of it, is the leftover, what can you not explain, and will that be predictive in the future?
Mm-hmm. Christian, do you have any response to that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that initial definition Colin gave, I guess, first in the post, and now kind of rehashing it again, I agree with it a lot. I think actually a very natural, like, canonical way to define course history. I think it's way better than like, oh, this guy's finished a lot of T10s, you know? It's actually very, very strong, I think, and like, I think I'd call it rigorous. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And the important thing is, like, you're measuring it, you know, relative to kind of other things you've already adjusted for, and whatever is kind of left over. I think that's all you can do, right? I don't think there's any kind of more magic that can go into it. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Colin, you're in the middle of a series on course history. You're 3 pieces into it. I think your 4th piece is coming out in a couple of days.
Yeah, it's going to be wrapped up at the end. So I promise I'll talk about something else for those that are sick of it by now.
Okay. So, but let's talk about that first piece. You talked about the commandments for measuring course history, your 4 commandments. Can you walk us through them and then talk about the reasoning behind each of them?
Yeah, so I'll list the commandments kind of one by one, and they all kind of have the same theme going under them. One, as I kind of mentioned just now, course history should be measured relative to expectations. So course history is essentially after I try to explain everything else about why a golfer did better or worse than expected a given course. That's the strongest way to measure course history. 2, there are lots of ways to measure how well a golfer does at a given round. Their fantasy points is one of them, adjusted scoring average. There's a lot, and not all metrics are the same in terms of measuring courses or performance rather. So it should be a non-noisy one. And we'll talk a lot about noise, I'm sure, in the next couple minutes. 3, sample size matters relative to the strength of your conclusions. Obviously, greater sample sizes at a given course will be indicate a stronger signal than most. And then the 4th is a 5-year window, kind of a rolling 5-year window. The most recent 5 years of history is better than including all history. And all of those are basically designed to weed out as much noise from course history as possible, because when you develop a metric that is essentially the sum of everything that you can explain, you better make sure that you're reducing noise as much as possible for it to be predictive out of sample. So that's the intent of all of those commandments.
Mm-hmm. So here's a follow-up question. If you have those 4 commandments, and it seems as if they're kind of slicing data sets in particular ways, do you think there's the possibility that you could potentially be overfitting in certain ways?
Oh, absolutely. And overfitting is one of the things that, fortunately, you can kind of test for when you try to test out of sample. We'll get into that a little bit maybe when you talk about course history at specific courses. But the idea of, oh, they have done really well here the last 3 years, am I giving them too strong a weight? That's something that you can kind of empirically test for, because if you are giving it, like, maybe if they are kind of overshooting it and maybe you're like overfitting in that sense, back testing says maybe I should dial down the weight that I'm getting, because even though they finish really strong, it may not be as predictive out of sample as you think. So you can always figure out, am I overfitting, and adjust how much you weight course history accordingly.
Mm-hmm. All right, Christian, is there anything in the commandments for course history that you disagree with or would adjust in some way, either the commandments themselves or the logic that drives them?
Yeah, I had one question about the using, let's say, the like head-to-head probabilities. It's more of a question than like than anything else,
Okay.
right? But what exactly, like mentioned how you have kind of more data points, but I think that might not be true since the data points are like very correlated, right? So each guy you have 150 data points, but once you kind of use those up, right, you've already like kind of reduced your degrees of freedom. You don't really have 150 square data points, right?
Yes, I completely agree. They're not independent observations. So it's like it's not a full 155 independent observations, but incorporating what I really like it for is it normalizes for scoring conditions. So instead of trying to predict someone's actual essentially golf round, scoring conditions have so much noise inherent in them that like when you see, it's one way of measuring how someone does relative to someone else. So kind of all of the noise that comes from scoring conditions are kind of adjusted for. And second, there are scoring conditions in which better players, like top end players, do generally worse. And if you have a good head-to-head model, that's something that you can kind of explicitly account for well in a head-to-head with using a head-to-head as your residuals. So it cuts down noise from a scoring end or from kind of scoring conditions primarily.
Cool. And just to make sure, because I've actually done a little bit of looking into like head-to-head Vegas lines based on head-to-head stuff, and just to make sure that you avoid that, right? Because it looks like those lines are like quite exploitable, just what I found.
Yeah, that I'm not using Vegas head-to-head lines for my head-to-head. Yeah, this is originally developed. Like I want to figure out my own probabilities.
Cool. Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I was actually just tangent. I was really surprised to see like how like egregious some of these lines were. But
well, yes, that's the underlying question: who's wrong, the model or the lines? So I take I assume generally an efficient market. So I've yet to see whether or not head-to-head lines are truly beatable. Because just because the model says that it's different, it doesn't necessarily mean that. All right,
there's always that question.
Yeah.
All right, that was a good question. I should say, because you guys know much more about this than I do and you're smarter than I do, if you have questions that you want to ask each other, definitely feel free to do that. So, Christian, you had mentioned the idea that the definition of course history that has to do with kind of explaining or quantifying the unexplainable, that is something that you actually you think is a good thing. It resonates with you. Can you talk a little bit more about how that differs from what most people think of as course history?
Yeah, I think like what we saw, at least very early on with PGA DFS, because that's really kind of, I didn't know much about golf analytics before then. I've read some papers, but that's about it. Is people kind of just look at like how they finished kind of absolutely, right, in these kind of spreadsheet kind of ways, and kind of eyeball it and be like, oh, he's done well in the past, right? And doesn't adjust for the fact that, well, like, okay, he might have been a way better player in the past, right? Like if you look at someone like Keegan Bradley, he has a lot of good course history everywhere, but he's not very good right now, right? Or he's gotten a lot worse than he was back in, his, I guess, prime. It's weird to say that. But yeah, right? So you have to kind of adjust for that, because if he's tearing up all these courses, right, back in the day, it doesn't mean he should have good course history. It should definitely be relative to everything else including course fit, right? And that kind of allows you to think about course history as like, pin it down a little bit like what it is, right, if that's important, right? Like, is it like having experience on the course? Is it mentally like knowing how to attack it? Like those are things that I think like definitely like once we get more specific could definitely be legitimate, right? Even though the data might not be able to say which is which, it's a little more comfortable once you kind of weed out, all right, what have I accounted for and what have I not accounted for? How can I maybe explain it if I'm looking to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so Colin, let's talk a little bit about the second article. You presented a graph showing the relationship between a course history score, and that was something that you created, and how golfers perform versus expectation. Can you tell us about how you calculated the course history score, and then also about the relationship you found between course history and how golfers have historically performed?
Yeah, so this may be the most nitty-gritty I get technical-wise in terms of explanation, but my metric for course history is roughly the total sum of their over or underperformance in all prior tournaments divided by about the square root of number of tournaments. And that's a lot of Greeks for a lot of people in the audience, but the idea is that the more positive or negative results you have over a larger sample, you kind of want to push it in the direction of like, it's almost like a joint probability thing. Like if someone finishes like 3rd, 5th, 10th, like what are the odds that they truly beat their expectations by random chance alone? And incorporating like sample size, essentially, incorporating both their actual performance and sample size kind of pushes it in a stronger, like, okay, like there's a higher chance we're getting an actual signal. So that's the strict definition of it. The articles are mostly kind of focused on, all right, what is the function of that thing that I calculated to their future head-to-head over or under performance relative to expectations. And it is a positive correlation. So that's the gist of the proof of course history.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the strength of that correlation?
I mean, relative to course fit itself, I mean, maybe I'd say it's like on average about half of like maybe course fit. It is a weight in a lot of the things that I do. I think obviously their overall level of skill is probably like much stronger weight in terms of like how good a golfer are they right now. But I think it is important to essentially those are essentially the edge cases. So even though like it's generally less important, there are specific spots where it is particularly important. So I think it matters from a roster construction point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Can we, Christian, I'm wondering if we can return to course fit a little bit because Colin just mentioned it. So at the beginning of the show, you said that you had kind of questions about the distinctions between course fit and course history, how one tied into the other. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So my main questions, like to myself when I was researching this, is like, all right, let's first see what happens if I include no course fit and I only look at course history and like how good a golfer is, right? In like a scoring average sense, right? And I found that like, if you get, like let's say a stroke above your normal kind of average of course history, right? That's going to translate to like 0.1 strokes of like predictive power, roughly. That's what I found, like maybe like 1 DraftKings point, right? Now, if you add in course fit, how much of that kind of goes away and is absorbed by course fit? And I think that really matters, in terms of how you do course fit, right? So I found that like linear course fit really does not explain much compared to like a non-linear, more kind of complicated course fit. And that kind of makes sense in terms of like how just golf works, right? If I'm looking at these stats we have, both traditional stats and kind of new shot level stuff, these just don't seem like linear variables, and I kind of have seen some evidence of that. As well. So I haven't fully I don't have an exact answer in terms of how much of what was explained by just course history is now just kind of like consumed by course fit. But my hunch is quite a bit if you have a really solid, course fitting algorithm. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I've seen just based on looking at, some out of sample results saying, okay, I'll include course history. I won't include course history. I'll include course fit. I won't include course fit. I'm going to draft kind of all these thoughts up on a blog post or add to a blog post I already have up. But yeah, that's kind of my current thesis is nonlinear course fit really helps explain a lot of that, like a ton of that variance. But if you don't have any course fit, you're going to see a ton of course history mattering, right? I think about a stroke of previous course history to 0.1 strokes of future predictive value.
Mm-hmm.
So I have 2 kind of questions on that one. One, when you say like essentially like a stroke added, does that mean that your metric for over or under performance is like essentially strokes per round?
Yeah. So I'm saying, all right, what is this like scoring average I have for him, right? Like weighted scoring average, adjusted and whatnot. Then how did he do, right? Adjusted as well. Right. So, and all these are adjusted relative. So if you shoot, let's say like 5 over at the US Open, right, that's going to count like shooting, a bunch under par at like Bay Hill. Right.
Right. So you're kind of adjusting for like essentially the scoring conditions after the fact, right?
Yes. So when I'm saying like, all right, here's how he's done previously, right? According to like this, I say use Bay Hill as like a 0, right? I'm saying, okay, right. Bay Hill, you shoot a 72 at, and it's a 72, and then everything else is kind of measured relative to that. So yeah.
Yeah. So that like The reason I'd be fuzzy on that one is because that kind of presumes that you can predict future scoring conditions with some level of accuracy. And yes, some of it is like broadly consistent year to year, but I feel like essentially trying to predict their actual strokes per round is going to be such a noisy target metric that I think that will also interfere with your ability to draw any kind of like relative level of performance of expectations. That's kind of my thesis. That's what I mean. Like, I think predicting everybody's like their performance relative to everyone else in that same tournament kind of adjusts for it. I mean, that's the reason why I like head to head. But I mean, I would be just off the top of my head weary about using essentially like predicted strokes per round in terms of your target metric. That's just kind of food for thought in general. I mean, you're free to do like whatever metric you want, but like I mean, I ran into a lot of trouble kind of using that kind of same approach. And the second one is on course fit. I am super interested about like the idea of nonlinear course fit because I've had to go the opposite way. And I'm fully open to the idea of maybe ShotLink just like allows for order of magnitude better course fit. But I've had to regularize my course fit. And by regularize, for the crowd listening at home, it essentially means drawing weaker conclusions about the strength of course fit based on the stats. Because you can say that someone fits, every time they say that someone fits it perfectly, give them a huge boost. I end up getting greater predictive power when I kind of tamp that down after the fact. Matt, that's basically the overfitting scenario that you're talking with, in which like, oh, these key stats correlate perfectly, I'm going to give them a huge boost, and then they never live up to like essentially the expected boost. So I'm curious. I mean, I don't know how much you want to talk about your secret sauce, but when you say nonlinear course history fit, does that just mean like what you're adding like second, third order variables into a linear regression, or are you going like something wonky like a neural net or support vector machine or any of the other nonlinear like equations out there?
Yeah, the second one.
Okay, so it's some like
some machine
you're not
learning
at liberty to say which. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, some in the class of machine learning algorithms. I mean, there's a lot of them, right? I've experimented with a bunch of them. Yeah, I mean, they're I think they're very, very good.
Okay. No, yeah. I'm open to nonlinear essentially being a good fit. I toss it in a neural network and it gives the answer. I am inherently, just given the amount that I've had to like weaken my conclusions about course fit. I mean, I guess I trust your process, but like that kind of like that surprises me, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I found. I mean, the out of sample results have been super awesome, and then comparing that to like just kind of linear stuff, and then adding second and third order terms to linear stuff doesn't really do much better. So yeah, it's been that was really interesting to find. That was super exciting. But yeah.
So, Colin, a follow-up on this. Before this, Christian had mentioned, and we've talked about this a little bit more, but I think there's more to be talked about here. The overlap, really, of course history and course fit. When you were doing your research, what did you find in terms of the correlation of those two metrics? How much overlap was there between the two?
I mean, it was something that I never looked as far as explicitly in the overlap, just because course fit was something that was already priced in. So like, I never thought to like back it out to be like, okay, like if I turned it off, how much would they correlate? Anecdotally, I think there's still too many instances of essentially negative course fit and positive course history, where the two fight one another, for me to conclude that course fit eats into course history enough. I still think there are performances that we can't explain through essentially the data that we have that justify using this kind of like, all right, we can't explain why this is so much better or worse than usual, but we're going to tack it on and make it a weight.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Christian, you say that you're thinking about updating a blog post that you have with more information, more ideas. Where do you think you are going from here in your course history research, kind of like the trajectory of where you're headed?
Sure. So I think that there's still I still have to kind of decide whether I'm going to kind of include it in what we include for subscribers and kind of whatnot. That's kind of a different thing. But in terms of the pure research, I'm fairly sure that if you have do it the right way, including it won't hurt if you have it. And definitely for Euro Tour stuff where there's like less granular data and the course fits are going to be weaker because you know less about players. Definitely, right? Like doing more research on that end, I think. with the Euro stuff. With the PGA Tour stuff, I think like, the course fits have explained away a ton of the course history. So I'll want to definitely like publish some out of sample results and kind of whatnot, but just to kind of put my thoughts in a place, in an organized way. But I mean, in terms of computing everybody's kind of course history scores, like that's already done. And I had, I guess, some success with the adjusted scoring average stuff. I don't believe it is as noisy as Colin does. I found like, scores have like a standard deviation of like about 3 per round. And like, that's a fairly non-noisy thing if you have the normally distributed scores, which they're close to being. So yeah, definitely comfortable with kind of the course history we've put together for each player.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Colin, a follow-up on this. Christian just mentioned Euro Tour and how course history might have different type of value there in comparison to PGA. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're just saying essentially like we can't parse out as good a course fit on Euro Tour because like presumably there's no shot length data, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
So like the fact that we don't have shot length course history can essentially pick up like some of that gap in terms of like why do they do particularly well? Well, we don't have a hole by hole layout of like wherever they're playing like the BMW Championship in Europe or the Alfred Dunhill or whatever, but we can kind of pick it up after the fact, and that's kind of the next best thing. So it's just dealing with less granular data. It'll fill in some shot length gaps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Colin, let's talk a little bit about your most recent piece. You noted that course history is more important at some courses. At other courses, it might be a little bit overrated, and then yet at other courses, it might be fairly noisy. If that's the case, what is your takeaway on course history in general? How is it that we should be using it?
The only level I'm kind of comfortable with it right now is using a one-size-fits-all rule. I kind of floated the idea of, all right, does it get a different weight at every single course? But you're dealing with such small samples there and you're subjecting yourself to so much noise that I think you could talk yourself into essentially a bad narrative that's not supported by the data about like, all right, I'm all in on course history this week because look at how much experience matters because I watch golf and, I know that's going to be super important. I think that'll get you into a lot more trouble than it's worth. And I would stick with kind of conservative course history rules in general, just because by definition we're dealing with something that we can't explain. So your weights should probably be a little bit lower than you might be tempted to use otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Christian, and what do you think? So if course history is more or less of a course-by-course phenomenon, like what does that mean? How do you think you would apply it?
That's a good question. I haven't thought. I know Colin's done some work on that. I really have no opinion as to, I haven't done any research as to is it a course by course phenomenon. I think that would kind of depend in kind of a latent factor sense on like, well, is it about experience? Is it about like how tough this course is to like mentally get down? Like, is it more about, what kind of is driving this unexplainableness in the data, right? Mm-hmm. Or is it just, course that we're not picking up on, right? And like, depending on what it is, and I don't think we can even have an answer to this question, at least I can't foresee one. It really depends on that. And I guess, and that's that. Actually, yeah, so going back to what you had said, Colin, about having low data, I have a question for you. I'm curious to hear whether you've kind of experimented with any like Bayesian stuff to kind of help for this lack of data.
What do you mean like by Bayesian stuff? Can you give an example of like a process?
Yeah, just like using priors, right, as opposed to looking at MLEs.
I guess I'm still not getting the question. Just like where's like the like updating prior beliefs essentially. Like I think that's roughly the metric of like what can we have previously not explained, like, and how do you project that going forward, right?
Sure. I guess in your estimate for someone's course history, is there like a prior term built into that? Or like, let's say, like how, I guess if you're using like, you kind of already have like the amount of data built into it now that I think about your metric, right? Whereas if you're using adjusted scoring average, it's not really built in, so you have to kind of build that in with
right. Yeah. So I have sample size built in terms of like strength and weakness.
That's pretty clever, actually.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. Cool. That was my question. That's a great answer for it.
All right, so guys, thank you for taking the time to do the show. One more question for each of you. It's about the U.S. Open this week. This year's being played at the Oakmont Country Club in Pennsylvania. I believe it's the 9th U.S. Open at Oakmont. What is the way that course history can be used for this particular tournament at Oakmont, and then the field of golfers in the U.S. Open this week? Hey, Christian, let's start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I think course history is going to be pretty much useless for Oakmont. That's like my intuition. If Angel Cabrera wins, good for him, but yeah, I'm sure the course is going to play. I've read some stuff and how the course is going to play a little different, like taking out a lot of trees. I'm not sure how much that actually matters. I know that they might make the conditions a little bit easier, from what I've heard, but that could be wrong. Maybe it'll matter. I don't know, right? Maybe it'll matter to the golfers. I think it's probably something we just can't measure. That's kind of the important part of this. 4 rounds of data at most is just not going to help us. And if these guys are playing rounds, they're obviously playing rounds there for practice and stuff like that. And if we just had that data, that might be a little better. But still, nothing that I have, will, course history wise will be included at all for the U.S. Open.
I agree with Christian. Course history gets a big fat 0 in terms of it just treat it like it's non-existent for the U.S. Open. It's well outside the window. Even though they played it prior, it was well outside of the 5-year rule that I've implemented. I just think that you're going to get into more trouble than it's worth. Just you're fitting to more noise and signal looking at any prior results. The only angle that you could hypothetically consider is either course history or course fit at similar courses. And that requires you to have some knowledge of what is a similar course. And I think that is a very dicey proposition from a data perspective to understand which courses are similar, and necessarily believing that course history at a similar course would translate into another similar course. Since this is a metric that we can't explain by definition, there's just too much a risk that there's stuff specific to that course, be it confidence or experience or some sort of prior knowledge that golfers have, that it's just, all signs are pointing to don't use it.
Mm-hmm. All right. What a useful question I just happened to ask right there.
The hard-hitting questions our listeners come here for all the time. It's just excellent journalism all around.
Exactly. All right, guys, thank you so much for being on the show. We've been speaking with Christian Drappi and Colin Davy. You can follow them on Twitter at DFS Albatross and ADJ Baseline. And you can follow me on Twitter at Matt F. The Oracle. I'm Matthew Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.